Okay, good evening. I'm Katie Campbell, Executive Director of the Golden Ball Tavern Museum. And for those of you who don't know, at the Golden Ball, we interpret the lived experience of colonial America on the eve of the Revolution through the eyes of the Jones family, who lived at the Golden Ball since 1768, so roughly 250 years. And it's six generations who've lived in the house, and we tell their story. What makes our site especially compelling is that it was not just a backdrop to the revolution, but it was an active part of the political and social tensions that were happening at that time. The Joneses were loyalists, and they were navigating the increasingly difficult relationship with their patriot neighbors. As you can imagine, at that time, um, there were considerable risks associated with being a loyalist in 1774, 75, and 1776. And being neutral was virtually impossible, although Isaac Jones did do a fair amount to try to stay that way. That's where tonight's speaker becomes so relevant to us. It's a pleasure for us to welcome Norman Poser, author of From the Battlefield to Stage, The Many Lives of General Burgoyne. Uh, Mr. Poser is emigrated to the United States when he was 11. He attended Harvard University and Harvard Law School. And at sort of his second phase of his career, he became a writer. He's an emeritus law professor at Brooklyn Law School, and he was an internationally respected academic for many years before he became a full-time author. So let's talk a little bit about General Burgoyne's campaign. Um, it was sort of a turning point in the war, and that's why it's important for us to understand what was happening with British leadership in America at that time. And I think General Burgoyne is a very good starting point for understanding how we dealt with imperial policy and military events that sort of tore the country apart for a short period of time. So with this sort of nuanced biography of General Burgoyne, we will discuss exactly how that happened and what he did during the war and after the war. So thank you for telling us this fascinating story of General John Burgoyne, and I will turn it over to Norman Poser. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Deb. Uh, it was only recently that I learned from you, Katie, that General John Burgoyne actually slept at the Golden Ball Tavern on the night of November 6, 1777. 3 weeks earlier, Burgoyne had surrendered his British army to General Horatio Gates's American forces at Saratoga, New York. Now, traveling a day or two after his troops, Burgoyne was on his way to Cambridge, Massachusetts. Gates had given Burgoyne generous surrender terms. The 3,500 officers and men of the surrendered army would be billeted in Cambridge while they waited for British ships to take them back to England on condition they would not return to fight against the Americans. While in the United States, the officers and enlisted men of the captive army would be treated humanely. I will return later to the fate of the captive army, but first I want to tell you about General Burgoyne. He was born in London in 1723. He came from a military family. His father and several other ancestors were army officers. His father was a gambler, so unsuccessful that he died in debtor's prison. His mother, on the other hand, was an heiress. From the time he was 10 until he was 15, Burgoyne attended Westminster School in London, which was then the training ground for many men who would distinguish themselves in politics, military, or the arts. John Nicol, the headmaster, imparted to the students an ethical code of conduct that influenced Burgoyne throughout his life. Unlike most schoolmasters of the day, Nicol didn't rely on the cane to maintain discipline. It was sufficient if a boy confessed his misconduct and showed repentance. Nicol's example can be seen in the way Burgoyne was to treat the men in the regiment he later commanded. It was then the custom in European armies, including the British, to flog men for even minor infractions. Burgoyne hated flogging. He advised his officers to treat soldiers as individual human beings, not as automatons. At the same time, he expected his officers to be able to perform any duty he required his officers to be able to, any duty he required his men to perform. For example, every cavalry officer had to know how to shoe a horse. Burgoyne was fundamentally conservative. He did not question the English class system, which existed in the military as much as in civilian life. He was against promoting enlisted men to become officers, but he regarded the ranks of sergeant and corporal as, I'm quoting, as the most signal honor that a man from the ranks could attain. Burgoyne left school and joined the British Army at the age of 15 as a cornet, the lowest officer rank. It's likely his mother bought a commission for him. Teenage Army officers and the purchase and sale of Army commissions were the practice at the time. In order to be an officer, one had to buy a commission from another officer who was retiring or who had been promoted to a higher rank. Surprisingly, the system worked pretty well. British armies in the 18th century won battle after battle and helped create an empire. The American Revolution was the only major war Britain lost. At some point, perhaps while at Westminster School, Burgoyne met James Smith Stanley. He was known by the ancient title of Lord Strange. He was the eldest son and heir of the 11th Earl of Derby, the head of the Stanley family, one of the wealthiest and most influential in England. Burgoyne and Lord Strange became close friends, and inevitably he met Lady Charlotte, the Earl's youngest daughter. They fell in love, but when Burgoyne asked the Earl for his daughter's hand, he refused. Without a title or great wealth, Burgoyne hardly seemed a suitable husband for an Earl's daughter. So they eloped. Burgoyne was 28, Charlotte 23. Predictably, the Earl was furious. In 18th century England, a man had little chance of getting to the top in the military or politics unless he was a member of one of the 200-odd great landowning families. As we will see, Burgoyne benefited greatly by his connection with the Earls of Derby. But one should not be too cynical about his motives. It was a genuine love match which lasted for 25 years until Charlotte died in 1776. Soon after their wedding, Burgoyne sold his commission and the couple left for France. Why they chose to exile themselves is not clear. He may have had gambling debts and left England to avoid the horror of debtor's prison, where outbreaks of typhus occurred sporadically. Or Burgoyne may have thought of his time abroad as a kind of grand tour, which upper-class Englishmen took to complete their educations. Also, it was cheaper to live in continental Europe than in England. They lived in France and then Italy for 5 years. Burgoyne busied himself learning to speak and write French, the universally accepted international language of the time. While in Aix-en-Provence, in southern France, Lady Charlotte gave birth to a daughter, whom they named Charlotte Elizabeth. She was their only child, and she died in England at the age of 10. But back to the Burgoynes. With war threatening, the Burgoynes returned to England, perhaps mollified by being presented with a granddaughter. The Earl of Derby took Burgoyne into his family, and Burgoyne rejoined the army as a captain. Pretty soon, with the backing of the Earl, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of a cavalry regiment. One of his roles as colonel was to recruit soldiers for the regiment, and he did it with a flourish. Here is what he said: "You will be mounted on the finest horses in the world, with a superb clothing and the richest accoutrements. You are everywhere respected. Your society is courted. You are admired by the fair or by a rich heiress, which renders the situation truly enviable and desirable. Enlist immediately." The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63, was a worldwide conflict. In America, it was called the French and Indian War, as many of you may know. As usual, Britain and France were enemies. One of Burgoyne's first assignments was as a staff officer in Britain's battle to take Belle-Île, a small rocky island 8 miles off the French coast. After 2 months of fighting, the British captured the island. While the campaign was still going on, Burgoyne's commanding general ordered him to take a boat to mainland France to negotiate an exchange of prisoners. In a letter to Lady Charlotte, this is one of the few letters that still exist of Burgoyne's. This was a long letter in which he described how the French army officers on the mainland wined and dined him. It was an example of the civility that often accompanied 18th century European wars. Just as opposing lawyers who attack each other mercilessly in court shake hands and enjoy a drink together after they leave the courtroom, enemy officers found no difficulty in being agreeable to each other once away from the battlefield. Burgoyne was to find war in America very different. Portugal was Britain's ally in the war. Spain was France's. When the Spanish threatened to invade poverty-stricken Portugal, Britain sent Burgoyne and his regiment to support the country. He gained reputation for bravery and leadership when he led his cavalrymen in a dawn raid on a Spanish supply depot, taking the Spanish soldiers by surprise and costing few casualties. The war ended with Britain acquiring an empire and Burgoyne returning home a hero. Burgoyne was also a politician. And here you get some idea of his versatility. He was first elected to Parliament in 1761. 7 years later, he ran for re-election in the town of Preston in northern England. The Preston election was one of the first and one of the most violent contested elections in England. In the end, Burgoyne won, but a court fined him £1,000. That's about $225,000 in today's currency for inciting violence by walking the streets of Preston holding two pistols in his hands. No doubt Lord Strange, his friend and now his brother-in-law, paid the fine. Burgoyne remained the Member of Parliament for Preston until his death. In the dual role of army officer and legislator, Burgoyne had a conflict of interest. He had a duty to represent the interests of his Preston constituents, but the king, that was King George III, expected him to vote the party line. He assured, that is, Burgoyne assured Lord North, the Prime Minister, that he would normally support the government's policy, but on matters of importance, he would act according to his own conscience. In the House of Commons, he fought the corruption of the East India Company, whose officers hugely enriched themselves by bribes and extortion of Indian rulers. During peacetime, Burgoyne led an active social life. A tall, handsome man, his good looks, engaging manners, and close connection with the Stanley family ensured his welcome in London's fashionable drawing rooms. He was a gambler for high stakes at Brooks's Club on St. James's Street, a club that still exists, which has been called the greatest gambling den in London. The lowest stake was £50, about $12,000 today. He was a skillful card player. An anonymous accusation that he was a card sharp is unlikely to be true. It's unlikely that the very distinguished people that he played cards with would tolerate a card sharp. People in the 18th century would gamble on anything. I'll give you one example. Burgoyne bet his friend, the young politician Charles James Fox, 50 guineas, a guinea was a pound plus a shilling, that, quote, 4 members of Brooks's Club are married or dead before Fox is called to the bar. Who won the bet is a detail lost to history. Burgoyne and the portraitist Joshua Reynolds liked to visit the green room of the Drury Lane Theatre, where the players could take a rest and visitors could come and fraternize with them. The literary giant Samuel Johnson refused to go there. He wrote to the actor and theater manager David Garrick that the silk stockings and white bosoms of your actresses excite my amorous propensities. It's likely that Burgoyne had affairs with women, including actresses. This is what he confessed in his will. He said, during a life too frequently blemished by the indulgence of one predominant passion, it has been a comfort to me to hope that my sensualities have never injured nor interrupted the peace of others. I'll just show you a picture of him. I don't know if you can see this, which was painted. This is a copy of a painting of Burgoyne, which is the original is in the Frick collection in New York, which was painted by Joshua Reynolds. Whatever philandering Burgoyne may have done, he was discreet, for no scandal ever touched him or threatened his marriage. In a private memorandum, he described his wife, Lady Charlotte, as, I'm quoting, the tenderest, faithfulest, the most amiable companion and friend that ever man was blessed with. Like many upper-class couples of the time, the Burgoynes spent much of their social lives separately. While her husband was playing cards for high stakes at Brooks's, Lady Charlotte might be at the opera or a royal wedding. Her letters to her friends show an acerbic wit, a love of gossip, and an occasional touch of malice. She described an English duchess as, and I quote, the most complete figure of affectation and absurdity I ever saw. Her rouge is deep colored and thick, not thickly, thick laid on. Lady Charlotte also liked to relay the latest political news to friends traveling abroad. In 1771, Lord Strange, the heir to the earldom of Derby and Burgoyne's friend, died suddenly from a stroke. He was in his 50s only. And the Earl's grandson, 18-year-old Edward Smith Stanley, became heir to the earldom. Burgoyne happily took on the role of mentor to Lord Stanley, as the young heir was known. In 1774, when Lord Stanley became engaged, Burgoyne organized an elaborate French-style garden party to celebrate the marriage, with shepherdesses neatly attired on swings and young men as swains to attend to them. Burgoyne wrote a two-act masque. A masque was a play that included singing and dancing. It was called The Maid of the Oaks, to be performed at the party. The actor and theater manager, David Garrick, who provided actors and set designers for this show, liked Burgoyne's masque and asked him to expand it into a 5-act play, which was performed at Drury Lane Theatre later that year. It was the first of several plays Burgoyne wrote. The Maid of the Oaks has a thin plot involving obstacles overcome by two lovers. But it's a merry romp with lots of inside jokes, some of them at the author's expense. Of particular interest is a character, Lady Bab Lardon, a lively product of Burgoyne's imagination. She's a creature of London. After 3 days away from the city, she's as uneasy as a mole in sunshine. Burgoyne portrays Lady Bab as a proponent of women's rights without in any way mocking or demeaning her. She says, this is what she says in the play, our men and women are put upon a footing, have put more upon a footing together in London than they ever were before in any age or country. Liberty is as well understood by our women as by our men. Was Burgoyne an early feminist? He was conservative on most social issues, but on this, it's hard to tell. By 1777, the American War of Independence had been going on for 2 years. Even with the difficulty, in the age of sailing ships, of suppressing a rebellion at a distance of 3,000 miles from home, the British had been mostly successful. General William Howe had escaped, besieged Boston, and taken New York City the previous year, although he failed to do battle with Washington's retreating army. General Guy Carleton, the British commander in Canada, had beaten off an American attempt under General Benedict Arnold to capture Quebec and turn Canada into a 14th state. And many in the southern colonies remained loyal to Britain. By 1777, Lord George Germain, the Minister for the Colonies, directed Burgoyne to prepare a plan for a campaign that would end the war that year. Burgoyne proposed a pincer operation. An army coming down from Canada would join forces in Albany, New York, with General Howe's army coming up the Hudson from New York City, then occupied by the British. The goal was to cut rebellious New England off from the other colonies and to lure George Washington into doing battle with the two combined British armies, where it was hoped he would be decisively defeated. Burgoyne's plan was approved by Lord Germain and King George III. Burgoyne, now a major general, was appointed commander of the Northern Army. Several generals were senior to him, but the Earl of Derby may have pulled strings to secure the command for him. At 54, this would be Burgoyne's one chance to lead an army into battle. On June 13, 1777, Burgoyne led his army from Canada into upstate New York. His force of 7,400 comprised several well-trained British regiments, a large German contingent, and some Native Americans and Loyalist Canadians. More than 300 women and children accompanied the expedition. These included the wife and 3 young children, one of whom was only 10 weeks old, of the general in command of the German troops. Enlisted men were permitted to bring women to cook, do the laundry, and gather fuel. Others were camp followers, most likely including prostitutes. All these non-combatants had to be fed, adding to the army's logistical problems. And I invite you now to, I think that Katie has the map of the campaign, where if you look at it, you can see the course of the campaign, which ended in Saratoga. At first, Burgoyne had what looked like a major success. You can see Fort Ticonderoga is marked on the map at the southern end of Lake Champlain, and it was regarded as the northern gateway to the colonies. The Americans had taken the fort early in the war, but now, confronted by an overwhelming force, its garrison abandoned it, and Ticonderoga fell without a battle. This cheap victory increased the optimism not only of Burgoyne, but also of General Howe in New York and the king and his ministers in London. But Howe was obsessed with the idea of capturing Philadelphia. It was the capital of the nascent American Republic, but it had no strategic value in the war. On July 23rd, Howe, against the advice of his subordinate generals, put his army on naval vessels, which happened to be under the command of his brother, Admiral Sir Richard Howe, and sailed south to the Delaware. The move separated the only 2 large British armies in America, Howe's and Burgoyne's, and he sailed south. The move separated the only 2 large British armies in America and left no significant British force between all of Washington's forces and Burgoyne. Astonishingly, Germain in London approved Howe's abandonment of the plan for the two British armies to join forces in Albany. Nevertheless, Burgoyne pressed on. He had told his troops at the beginning of the campaign that he would never retreat. Their march through miles of wilderness to the Hudson took weeks. You can see it on the map, and he ended up at Fort Edward on the Hudson, on the east side of the Hudson. The logistical problems that Burgoyne faced were formidable. He had great faith in the value of artillery in a battle, but every gun that he brought with him had to be pulled by 3 or 4 horses. And the horses required oats, and especially in the summer months, plenty of water. 2 weeks after the start of the campaign, supplies were low. Burgoyne had counted on support from local loyalists, but the support never materialized. There were loyalists in the region, but the American patriots intimidated them by threats and violence. American forces under another general, Philip Schuyler, who those of you who might have seen the musical Hamilton will remember him as Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law, adopted a scorched earth policy, burning down buildings and destroying crops. The path that Burgoyne's army followed was only a rough track in the wilderness, and Schuyler had his men cut down trees and lay them across Burgoyne's path. Burgoyne did not reach Fort Edward on the east bank of the Hudson until July 30, 6 weeks after the start of the expedition, and he stayed there for another 6 weeks, waiting for supplies and the artillery to catch up with him. Meanwhile, the American army and militias gathered around. By this time, Burgoyne's army of 7,400 men was down to 4,500, depleted by deaths in battle, including an unsuccessful and disastrous attempt to raid an American supply depot in Bennington, Vermont. And I just add that there was this underestimation of the American forces, which went throughout this war. Sickness, desertion by the Native Americans who had no stake in the war and saw little opportunity for plunder was another reason for this army withering away. And also the need to leave garrisons in the fortresses like Ticonderoga that they had taken during the campaign. Burgoyne had to decide now, as he sat there on the east side of the Hudson, whether he was going to cross the river and fight the Americans without Howe's help or return to Canada. Burgoyne was by nature a risk taker, and yet there were risks whatever he did. As he pondered, it's likely he thought of the fate of Admiral John Byng, B-Y-N-G, who 20 years earlier in the 7 Years' War had ordered his fleet to retreat from the Mediterranean island of Minorca, leaving it to be occupied by the French. Convicted by a court-martial of negligence, Byng was executed by a firing squad on the deck of his flagship. The French author Voltaire wrote, "In England, it's useful to kill an admiral from time to time to encourage the others." For Burgoyne to retreat without having fought a battle with the bulk of Washington's army was unthinkable. One of Burgoyne's officers later testified that the army was in high spirits and that General Burgoyne's character would not have stood very high with the army, this country, or the enemy had he halted at Fort Edward. Burgoyne's army crossed the Hudson on September 13 and 14 on a floating bridge made up of boats chained together and made their camp at the small town of Saratoga, now renamed Schuylerville, 18 miles east of the present city of Saratoga Springs. On the 19th, he tried to break through the American defenses to the south. During a 4-hour battle, fresh troops continually reinforced the Americans, while there were no reinforcements to replace the British and German troops who fell in battle. A British soldier wrote in his diary, "General Burgoyne behaved with great personal bravery. He shunned no danger. His presence and conduct animated the troops, for they greatly loved the general. He delivered his orders with precision and coolness." By the close of the battle, 500 British and German soldiers had been killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Burgoyne's army controlled the battlefield, but it had failed to break through the American defenses. As night fell, the horror continued, even increased. Severely wounded men were left on the field because any attempt to rescue them ran the risk of being killed by American sharpshooters. The cries from the wounded were mixed with the howls of the wolves that came out to eat the flesh of the dead and dying men. It seemed strange that there was no call for a ceasefire to save the wounded men, but this was an ideological war, very different from the European wars that Burgoyne knew. For the next 2 weeks, the two opposing armies camped on the battlefield, so close to each other they could hear each other's voices. On October 7, Burgoyne attacked again. It was his final attempt to force a passage to Albany. Again, the army suffered high casualties, but failed to accomplish its goal. Burgoyne, after 4 months of fighting and trudging through the wilderness, Burgoyne's army was down to 3,500 men, fewer than half the number who had set out from Canada 4 months later. Excuse me. Four months earlier, I meant. The men were starving, thirsty, for even water was difficult to obtain at Saratoga, and utterly exhausted. And they were surrounded by American army troops and militia numbering over 15,000, 3,500 against 15,000. Burgoyne took the remnants of his exhausted army back to Saratoga, where he convened a council of war of his senior officers. The council of war voted unanimously to surrender. The consequences of the surrender were felt throughout the world. A month after the news reached Europe, the French foreign minister informed Benjamin Franklin, the American envoy in Paris, that his government wished to enter into an alliance with the United States. And a month later, France declared war on Britain. Spain soon joined France in the war. What had begun as an attempt by Britain to hold on to its North American colonies was now a global war in which Britain had no allies. Although the war continued for 3 more years, Saratoga all but assured the independence of the American colonies. You will recall that the surrender terms called for Burgoyne's captive army to be marched to Cambridge, where they would wait to embark in Boston for British ships to take them back to England. The local people along the line of march, and presumably at the Golden Ball Tavern, were friendly and sympathetic. But this changed rapidly once the army arrived in Cambridge. On October 23rd, the day after news of the surrender reached Boston, the Massachusetts legislature met to decide what provision should be made for the prisoners. It ordered barracks to be built on the bare hilltops that then existed between Cambridge and Boston. These crude huts, without foundations or windows, were open to the snow and wind of a New England winter. To make matters worse, the troops had no winter clothing. Expecting a short summer campaign, Burgoyne had ordered the troops to leave behind in Canada all blankets and baggage that could be spared during the summer months. A committee of Cambridge inhabitants, perhaps the most ardent patriots in all of the United States, ruled out any housing for Burgoyne's officers, who either were left to squeeze into their soldiers' cramped barracks or pay outrageous prices to occupy inns or taverns in Cambridge. This was a violation of the terms of the surrender, which called for the British officers to be housed in accordance with their rank. Not a single householder offered to take a British officer into their homes. Furthermore, the Cambridge Committee refused to allow the officers to occupy the mansions that fleeing loyalists had left behind empty at the start of the Revolution. General William Heath, the American military commander in New England, tried his best to enforce General Gates's surrender terms. Seeing that the buildings of Harvard College would soon be left empty by a 3 months winter vacation, he approached the Harvard overseers. They were willing to allow Burgoyne's officers to occupy the empty spaces, but the Harvard faculty voted to exclude them. So the unfortunate British officers were, so to speak, left starving in a land of plenty. On November 14, less than 2 weeks after he arrived in Cambridge, Burgoyne wrote to General Gates complaining about the treatment his troops were receiving in Cambridge, and that, and I quote, "the public faith is broke," he wrote. Congress chose to interpret those 5 words to mean that Burgoyne repudiated the surrender treaty and that Congress was now free to reject Gates's generous surrender terms, including the promise to allow the captive army to return to England. George Washington pointed out that the condition that these soldiers would not return to fight in America was meaningless, because once in England, the soldiers of the captive army could replace troops in Britain who could be sent to America. The captive army was kept in Cambridge until the following winter, when they were marched through snowstorms 550 miles to Charlottesville, Virginia. Thomas Jefferson, then governor of Virginia, expressed his sense of shame in these words: "I cannot help feeling a most thorough mortification that our Congress should have permitted an infraction of our public honor." Excuse me. A year later, what remained of Burgoyne's army was marched to Maryland and then to Pennsylvania. By 1783, when a peace treaty was signed, only 470 men remained of the 3,500 who surrendered at Saratoga. Many had died of disease or exposure. A British corporal recalled, "Our men died like rotten sheep." Others escaped and blended into the countryside, some marrying American women. It's generally thought that Congress refused to free Burgoyne's army in order to use it as a bargaining chip to gain recognition for the United States as a sovereign nation. Although there were prisoner exchanges during the last years of the war, Congress refused to allow officers or soldiers of Burgoyne's army to be part of the exchanges. When Burgoyne was allowed to return to England as a prisoner on parole, he asked the government for a court-martial open to the public so that he could explain his surrender and protect his reputation. This was refused. The king and his ministers made every effort to pin the blame for the disaster exclusively on Burgoyne. Lord Germain, who had allowed Howe to abandon Burgoyne in upstate New York, continued as colonial minister and later was elevated to the peerage. And Lord North's ministry showed little interest in inquiring into Howe's actions in America. In 1780, as a member of Parliament, Burgoyne finally had an opportunity to vindicate himself. He conducted hearings in which his officers, who the Americans had released on parole, testified to the battles that were fought and the difficulties encountered. To a man, they supported Burgoyne. They had not a word of criticism of his conduct, a rare tribute to a defeated general by his troops. Burgoyne defended his own conduct. Arguably, he was free from his orders to advance to Albany once Howe had shown that he had no intention of joining Burgoyne there. Still, many historians agree that Howe's stubborn decision to capture Philadelphia was a willful mistake that dwarfed all the other misjudgments and blunders that led to Saratoga. Now I'm going to change my focus. The theater was central to Burgoyne during the last years of his life. In the years that followed Saratoga, he wrote 3 plays that were performed in London's Drury Lane Theatre, as well as prologues and epilogues for plays written by others. The Lord of the Manor, which opened in January 1780, was a light comedy set to music, but it contained some serious satire in which he exposed the Army's callous recruiting practices. Burgoyne's 5-act comedy, The Heiress, opened in 1786. It was his most successful dramatic work. The play's great strength was that Burgoyne, unlike many other playwrights, was personally familiar with the elite social scene that he portrayed. The Heiress reflects Burgoyne's innate conservatism. The established upper classes are decent, law-abiding people, while those who aspire to join the upper classes are not. And not least, the play is laced with humor. A scene in which a blue-stocking lady tries to teach a social climber how to speak like an aristocrat is hilarious. The Heiress was translated into French, German, Italian, and Spanish, and was performed in several European capitals. The diarist Horace Walpole, who rarely had a good word to say about Burgoyne, raved about the play. Burgoyne's battles and speeches will be forgotten, he wrote, but his comedy of The Heiress continues to the delight of the stage. Burgoyne's last dramatic work was Richard Coeur de Lion, Richard Lionhearted, a musical piece for which he wrote the libretto. It's very loosely based on the life of 12th century English king Richard I, who spent most of his short reign fighting in European wars. When Richard is taken prisoner, Matilda, a young woman who's in love with him, dresses as a boy and leads an army that rescues him. Opera lovers can see a resemblance of the play to the story of Beethoven's opera Fidelio. The play was a success, perhaps because it reflected Burgoyne's strong feelings of patriotism. As an aside, the 12th Earl of Derby, young Lord Stanley, had assumed that title in 1776 when his grandfather died, had a passion for horse racing and the wealth to indulge in it. In 1780, he founded the Derby, a race for 3-year-olds at Epsom Downs near London, which gave his name to the world's most famous horse race, and to the Kentucky Derby in the United States. Burgoyne's wife, Lady Charlotte, died in 1776. 4 years later, Burgoyne, now approaching 60, met Susan Caulfield, a young actress and singer. Although they were together for 12 years until his death and had 4 children, a boy and 3 girls, they never married. Little is known about her. Burgoyne's descendants may have destroyed his letters to hide their birth out of wedlock. In an age when letter writing was the main mode of communication, very few letters to and from Burgoyne exist today. When Burgoyne was not writing plays or participating in their production, he was leading an active social life in London's gambling clubs and fashionable drawing rooms. He was a member of the Devonshire House Circle, a group of aristocrats, artists, and politicians who gathered at the grand Piccadilly home of Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire. There he could meet his friends, including the theater managers David Garrick and Richard Sheridan, and the politicians Charles James Fox and Edmund Burke. Lady Georgiana turned her drawing room into a professional-like gambling hall, which enabled Burgoyne to satisfy his social and gaming tendencies in the same venue. Burgoyne was a regular visitor to mainly literary gatherings at the home of Mary Robinson, one of the most beautiful actresses of the day, who had a reputation for promiscuity. Burgoyne liked to write semi-erotic verses for his friends. A stanza of a poem he wrote to Robinson will give you the flavor of his versifying. This is it. When on thy lovely, perfect face the sportive dimpled smile we see, with eager hope the cause we trace, and wish to share each bliss with thee. In the House of Commons, Burgoyne participated in a debate over an army officer who had been removed from his command for having voted in Parliament against the government. Burgoyne argued that the military should be shielded against political reprisals. In another parliamentary debate over an army officer who had wrongfully killed a native in India and pleaded that he had acted on orders, Burgoyne argued that military justice was subject to a higher law, the law of humanity. He regarded the military as a sacred calling that must be protected from outside pressures, but at the same time, its members are expected to adhere to the highest standards of conduct. On August 3, 1792, Burgoyne attended a new play, The Surrender of Calais, at the Little Theatre in the Haymarket in London. After the play, he returned to his home in Mayfair. He died suddenly that night. The cause of his death was never established. Some said it was gout, a painful complaint that afflicted him throughout much of his life. But gout is unlikely to cause sudden death. More likely, it was a heart attack, stroke, or aneurysm. Ironically, the man who surrendered at Saratoga spent the last evening of his life at a play about another surrender, albeit a British victory. In 1347, in the Hundred Years' War, a French army surrendered to the British, who occupied the city of Calais across the English Channel from England, giving Britain a tiny foothold on the European continent for 200 years. Burgoyne's will left the annual income of £4,000, about $1 million today, to Susan Caulfield. On her death, the principal to be distributed in equal amounts to his 4 children, whom he acknowledged. But after creditors had been paid, very little was left for Caulfield and the children. An obituary noted, "He has died richer in esteem than in money. In the saving or securing of that, he had no talent." Burgoyne's children would have been left in poverty had not his nephew, the young Earl of Derby, stepped in. Moved by his long friendship with Burgoyne, he offered to take responsibility for the children's maintenance and education. His act of generosity and love made it possible for Burgoyne's son, John Fox Burgoyne, and his grandson, Hugh Burgoyne, to have distinguished military careers, and for Burgoyne's 3 daughters to make genteel marriages. But Derby's generosity had a cost. Susan Caulfield had to give up custody of her children to Derby. We don't know how she felt about the bargain. More than likely, she reluctantly consented in order to assure them a better future than she could provide. In 1897, more than a century after Burgoyne's death, George Bernard Shaw gave him a cameo role in The Devil's Disciple, a historical drama set in upstate New York shortly before his surrender at Saratoga. Shaw gave Burgoyne the nickname of Gentleman Johnny, which has stuck. At least 2 books about Burgoyne have that as its title. In a note that accompanied the play, Shaw refers to Burgoyne's, and now I'm going to quote, Burgoyne's peculiar critical temperament and talent, artistic, satirical, rather histrionic, and his fastidious delicacy of sentiment, his fine spirit and humanity. A description I would subscribe to. Thank you.
You, Norman. That was really fascinating. Thank you so much for this. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting notifications. Thank you so much. I'd also like to thank the Weston Cultural Council and the Massachusetts Cultural Council for supporting this lecture and the fascinating story of General John Burgoyne.
Thank you for listening to me.
Oh, a pleasure. A total pleasure.